Shall we check?
I think I'm live.
Yes, wonderful. Nicole Krauss, we've met personally many years ago, but I still remember myself reading, maybe it was 75 pages I got from your agent. I was on my way from New York. It wasn't the most important book on the agent's list. I don't know why. I'm not claiming that it was wrong, but I've been told something else was very, very urgent. So I read this very, very urgent book, and I disliked it so much, so I just put it away. And then I wanted to sleep, and then I said, well, I also got this. And then I didn't sleep at all the rest of my trip. Because now I have to warn you all that this conversation is a talk between a publisher and a writer. So you are better prepared that I have to be a little personal here, because I've been a publisher for soon 45 years. Next year we are getting 45, and maybe we published something around 2,000 books, maybe not that much altogether, thinking of how many books there are there, but there are just a few, very, very few, that stay with us publishers forever. And we know when it happens, in the middle of the night, when you go from New York to Stockholm, for instance. The book I started to read without any real expectations. The title of the book was History of Love, and it's a way history of my love for your writing. Something happened that night. I felt seen by you, by this unknown author. I felt I was laughing, and I was loving every single word of these 75 pages. I mean, it was early stage. The book was even not written, the whole of it. But one thing I knew, not only that I didn't want to sleep the rest of my trip, but the first thing in the morning I did, the first thing I did when I got to my office was to check with the agent and say, I want this book badly. Sorry for this long introduction, but the relationship between a publisher and a writer is very close to a love story, a love relationship. It's about language. It's about a way of the author, how you present the word around us, and how you make us understand ourselves better. You did that with this book early in your writing. So altogether there are 4 novels, but from the beginning you wanted to be a poet, I've learned. That was the dream of your life. So what happened between the poetry and me?
Yeah.
Reading your
I always
novel.
describe it as my fall from grace.
Yeah.
I would have been shocked if you had told me when I was 15 or 16 and all I wanted to do was to somehow become a poet. If you would have told me that I would be doing something as lowly as writing prose, I would have been completely...
It was low because poetry was so much finer, so much more...
I think that had to do with later, like when I was 18... I fell under the heavy influence of an older poet, a Russian poet called Joseph Brodsky, and he was very serious about what he believed poetry could be, and his feeling was basically that, you know, language is the goal of our species, but poetry was the apex of the language. Yeah. And so anything less, in a way, would be really... And I met him when I was 18, and I knew him until he died 4 years later, and he used to... He was never actually formally my teacher, but he we lived far apart, but I would send him my poems, and he would correct them on his typewriter, and he would send them back. And
that was sweet.
yeah, I mean, it was wonderful. And he taught me a lot about how serious literature can be, how seriously we should take it. And really, it was only after he died, and it coincided with my also around the time that I was finishing school and had to decide what to do. And my poems had just gotten. He insisted on writing formal verse with the notion that you had to know what you were being free from if you were going to write free verse. And I had somehow arrived at a place where the poems that I was trying to write became so constrained, so tight and small, and I had lost the very thing that made me start writing, which was a sense of freedom that you have when you look at the blank page. And so I just felt like I had to break the window or open a door somehow to make a larger space for myself to write. So I just thought, I had a friend, he was trying to write a novel, and I thought, maybe I'll try. Why not? I'll try. What could be the worst? And that became my first novel. But it also became the moment in which I discovered that I felt at home in writing novels.
There are several things I would like to pick up from what you said now, because you mentioned you feel free when you write, freer as a human being. And then I've been listening to a few things you've been saying in the few days you are in Sweden, and also we were also talking about the reader. Once we read, we are free as people. I mean, we feel we are looking for things, important things that we can apply in our lives or understand maybe, but we also feel free. It's interesting about literature and your thoughts about in what way you feel free. Because when you say you started with the poems and then you wanted to continue with the novels. Then you mentioned some in some talks here that you love filling novels with people, to people them, as you mentioned it. And maybe that's the difference. But when you make a story and find your main characters. We are going to talk about a few of them very soon. But what does it do to you? How does this make your life more free?
Well, I think it's easy to imagine, even if you don't write, even just as readers, when we open the world of a book that we really somehow connect with. There's something that happens to us in this magical act of empathy where we throw ourselves and our consciousness, our memories, our experience into another, and we meet the author halfway in that character. So the author gives us a character, but we're the ones furnishing that character with feeling and experience. And something magical happens in which the narrow channel of ourselves suddenly expands, and we become not just ourselves, but also that person. And then the more you read, the more peopled you become, the more expansive you become. And I do think that really great books, the ones that are great for us, and for each of us that's different, but those characters or stories live on in us and keep our dimensions expanded in those ways. So I think I got caught onto that very early as a reader when I was young, and you become addicted to that feeling because you see that having one life is not enough. One reality is too mean. You need more. You want more, and that's part of the freedom. But it's also the freedom not just to express oneself, to create oneself. The notion that when we write on the page, language is generative. We are creating a sense of who we are, who we want to be. We're creating the world anew. And that to me is also still something that propels my work.
It sounds wonderful, especially when, as we as readers have another version of this experience, because you are feeling the books with characters and maybe discovering special sides of yourself. I mean, finding out about your perception of life and of whatever it is. Let's not be too theoretical. I mean, in this book, latest book, you are exploring even what it means to change completely, to make a big change in your life. In this book, there is Nicole, who is very much like yourself, a writer who is in the middle of a kind of crisis in her life. There are 2 children, and there is a decision of divorce, and she is trying to understand where she's going from there. It's a chaos in her life. I had this impression that by writing about it, you are trying to understand it and to give us, the readers, your understanding, and then we are applying it to our lives.
Yeah.
This is...
well, I think, I mean, again, that's always the difference between like the lived life and the contemplated life. Like we just can't do both at the same time. We can't live and contemplate. And while we're contemplating, we need to remove ourselves momentarily from life in order to see it. And I think, writing allows for that. It becomes like a woven into your habit of living, that you, on a daily basis, take yourself apart from the world or your life to sit and think on it or think on things. So I think it's interesting. You were saying she finds herself in a moment of chaos, but actually I think the characters in this book choose to leave behind old orders. There's always a choice to stay in an orderly life, and the orderly life is the one that you've always had, the story you've always told yourself about who you are. It's staying with the original forms you chose for yourself when you were young. And that is living an orderly life, even if it doesn't feel orderly on the inside. But then there's the other decision, which is to break open your life in ways that can be very messy. And you are inviting, I wouldn't even call it chaos, I would call it formlessness. Formlessness, which is fundamentally part of nature. I mean, we see it in the seasons now. We're reaching a moment where nature loses its form and just self-destructs only to find new form. But in our own lives, we are terrified of formlessness because we want stability. So
we usually say, it's so interesting. We usually say that one of the words we are very much in love with is flexibility. Whoever is looking for somebody for work, you have to be flexible. And the truth is that we are not that flexible, and we hate change. You say, and change is a way of formlessness. But at the same time, it's so interesting, especially when you read this book, because this book is about change in life. You write about, you create patterns in our lives. As you say, we have our story, life story. We've been telling ourselves that our life is about, and all of a sudden something happens, and we have to change the story. And it's both hard, and then you say it's also powerful.
I think this, in a sense, writing this book was the part of the hope was to invite the reader into a conversation, and the conversation would go something like this: Why is it that, given how much we know about memory and the way memory works, and our knowledge that memory is a creative act, right? We don't have any access to historical truth. We only have narrative truth. Our memories function creatively. We know that, and we know, if we've read even the tiniest bit of neuroscience, we know about the brain, the human brain, that it needs a coherent narrative more than it needs an accurate account of reality. And so we will always prioritize the coherence of the narrative. That means that what we call the self is like a really long story. And we've been telling this, actually our parents start to tell a story about us, and we continue it and edit it to some degree and add to it to some degree. But if we admit that it's a narrative, I guess the question I found myself asking at a certain point is, why are we so meager about how creative we are with that narrative? And why are we so creative when we're in the realm of art, either writing or reading? We allow this expansion that I was talking about. But then back in life, when we have to pick up the children and do the shopping and face our spouse, our narrative narrows back down to the same story we've been telling, without freedom and without enough capaciousness to actually fit us. So the question is, if we take an example of these two characters, Epstein and Nicole, and I chose Nicole very deliberately to say, let's use me as a guinea pig. Let's take these details of my life, but then let's put both of these characters through the paces of fiction, because the things that happen to them are admittedly extraordinary, right? What happens when we apply our narrative function to them? Do they grow? Do they shrink? Do they find courage or not? Do they gain? Do they lose? Both of those things. And so it's kind of to open this conversation about how we think about our own stories and our own selves.
It's fascinating when you read it. I have to tell you a little bit about the story in the book. The two characters are Nicole. She's in her 40s, early 40s, and she leaves her home in New York. There is a divorce, and she needs to think, and she goes to Tel Aviv.
She hasn't gotten divorced yet.
Not yet. She's on
thinking
her way.
About whether she can stay in her life or not.
Sorry. You're correct. So she leaves for Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is a place she has been spending a lot of time in as a child. She goes to the place she loves and remembers, and that's Hilton Hotel in Tel Aviv. And the idea is to just think and understand what's happening in her life and what might happen next. And so she's one character. She is a writer, but she can't write for the moment. She has difficulty to write. And there is another character, a parallel life, called Epstein, and he's a very, very rich guy, a lawyer, also living in New York. And for years, for his whole life, he's been very sure about everything. He has been larger than life, kind of man. When he comes into the room, everybody listens to his opinions. He's a guy who knows everything, and who is certain about things. And all of a sudden things are changing. His parents die, and that shakes him. And he leaves New York, and things are starting to happen. It starts with a coat, a stolen coat, and then all of a sudden this coat is gone, and he's disturbed by it, and all of a sudden he decides to give away everything he owns. Starts with things, giving away money, lots of money, and he can't stop. And he also goes to Tel Aviv after the parents died, and there things starting to happen. Things his family doesn't really understand. He has grown up children. These parallel lives are told in a beautiful way, I have to say. So interesting, because they are something is changing. A big change. Formlessness. Formlessness is a beautiful word, much better than change in a way, and also to accept formlessness, accept that we don't have to understand everything. And there are moments in this book which you have to read, because there is no time to tell you, but moments when he discovers that there is silence, that he doesn't have to have words for everything. He can be uncertain about things. And that is also an interesting moment in his life, that life is not what we have always been thinking, and the relationships with people are not the same. And things are happening to both of them, and they end up in the desert completely different parallel stories. I won't tell that much about, but it's also a book about writing that I loved reading about. I've been coming back to parts of this book because I love them so much. It's about bounds in our lives and how we bind, how the binding with our past, with our parents, and how we try to find the freedom and get out of them. And as a writer, Nicole is trying, and I even would like you to read a little passage about it because it's so well expressed. Because she wants to be free. She wants to write whatever she likes to write. At the same time, there are people in this characters coming here claiming that she's a Jewish writer, so she has a heritage, and she has to write about the past, the bonds in her life, which are much stronger than she is. And the question is how to handle it. And I think that we all feel it, that we are ancestors. We have had ancestors. We have some kind of some kind of heritage. It doesn't have to be a Jewish heritage that when we are not writers, we are still acting on, and it's important and it's interesting to see how. I don't know if it's okay for you to
Sure.
read this little passage I have picked up, and then we can talk more. I don't know if I did this. No, wait a second.
I have it.
Yes.
This is a section that it comes in the first. So when you first start the book, you hear about Epstein, and then you hear from Nicole, and then it goes back and forth between those two throughout the book. So this is her first chapter. And she's come to Tel Aviv, but she's been propelled there. Like she can't sleep at night in New York, and suddenly she wakes up in the morning, she realizes she's packed her suitcase, and she's already ready to go. And she doesn't. So there's a way in which there's this unstoppable momentum which has pulled her to Tel Aviv. And once she's there, there's this man who contacts her father's cousin, and then her, who wants to meet her. And this man, his name is Friedman, and he may or may not have been former Mossad, and he may or may not have been a retired professor of literature of Tel Aviv University. She never knows exactly which, but he kind of, not quite accosts her, but he insists on meeting her, and he takes her on this long walk through Tel Aviv, and he has something in mind that he wants her to do. He wants to inscribe her into his project. So this is sort of coming after a long conversation with this, and it begins with a quote from Friedman. "I've read your novels. We all have," he said, gesturing toward the other tables in the restaurant. "You're adding to the Jewish story. For this, we're very proud of you." It was unclear who the we in question was, since the restaurant was empty, but for an old dog with a dusty coat of curly hair lying on its side in the sunlight. Regardless, the compliment touched a nerve in me, as it has been touching a nerve in Jewish progeny for millennia. On the one hand, I was flattered. I wanted to please. From the time I was a child, I understood the necessity of being good and doing whatever possible to make my parents proud. I don't know that I ever fully explored what was behind the necessity, beyond that it plugged a hole through which darkness could otherwise spill, a darkness that always threatened to pull my parents under. But even as I brought home accolades by the armful and stuffed my parents with pride, I resented the burden and the contortions it required, and knew all too well how it hemmed me in. The very first Jewish child was bound and nearly sacrificed for something more important than him. And ever since Abraham came down from Mount Moriah, a terrible father, but a good Jew, the question of how to go on binding has hung in the air. If a loophole was found out of Abraham's violence, it was this: let the ropes be invisible, let there be no proof that they exist, except that the more the child grows, the more painful they get, until one day he looks down and sees that it's his own hands doing the tightening. In other words, teach Jewish children to bind themselves. And for what? Not for beauty like the Chinese, and not even for God or the dream of a miracle. We bind and are bound because the binding binds us to those who are bound before us, and those bound before them, and those before them, in a chain of ropes and knots that goes back 3,000 years, which is how long we've been dreaming of cutting ourselves loose, of falling out of this world and into another where we aren't stunted and deformed to fit the past, but left to grow wild toward the future. But now there was more. The need to make one's parents proud is deforming enough. The pressure to make one's whole people proud is something else again. Writing had begun so differently for me. At the age of 14 or 15, I'd grasped it as a way to organize myself, not just to explore and discover, but to consciously grow myself. But if it had been a serious occupation, it had also been playful and full of pleasure. And yet as time passed, and bit by bit what had been only an obscure, idiosyncratic process became a profession, my relationship to it had changed. It was no longer enough for it to be the answer to an inner need. It also had to be many other things, to rise to other occasions. And as it rose, what had begun as an act of freedom had become another form of binding. I wanted to write what I wanted to write, however much it offended, bored, challenged, or disappointed people, and disliked the part of myself that wished to please. I tried to rid myself of it, and on a certain level had succeeded. My previous novel had bored, challenged, and disappointed an impressive number of readers. But because the book, like the ones before it, was still undeniably Jewish, filled with Jewish characters and echoes of 2,000 years of Jewish history, I'd avoided sloughing off the pride of my landsmen. If anything, I'd managed to increase it, as part of me must have secretly hoped to do. In Sweden, or Japan, they didn't care much about what I wrote. No, I should have changed it. It's not me, it's a character with the same name. But in Israel, I was stopped in the street. On my last trip, an elderly woman in a sun hat secured with a strap under her chubby chin had cornered me at the supermarket. Gripping my wrist between her meaty fingers, she'd backed me into the dairy section to tell me that reading my books was, for her, as good as spitting on Hitler's grave, never mind that he doesn't have one, and that she would read every page I wrote until she herself was in the ground. Pinned against the kosher yogurt display, I smiled politely and thanked her, and only after she held up my wrist in the air like a heavyweight champion's and shouted out my name to the disinterested checkout girl did she finally leave off, though not before flashing the faded green numbers tattooed on her forearm like the badge of an undercover police. A few months before that, my brother had gotten married at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The toast had gone on for a long time, and when they were finally finished, I'd made a beeline for the ladies' room. I'd made it halfway across the lobby when a woman in a headscarf pushed a stroller into my path. I tried to move around her, but she wouldn't let me pass, and looking me in the eyes, she'd spoken my name. Frazzled and confused, I was also on the verge of wetting myself. But I wasn't getting away so easily. With a flick of the wrist, she tore back the hood of the stroller to reveal a tiny, red-faced infant. In a hoarse voice, she whispered the name of the girl in one of my books. The baby swiveled its tiny head, and when its myopic gray eyes passed over me, both seeing and not seeing, her hands jerked out in front of her like a monkey trying and failing to grasp the branch, and she let out an ear-splitting scream. I looked up at the mother's swollen face and saw tears welling in her own eyes. "Because of you," she whispered.
It's not easy to be a writer, especially when you go to Tel Aviv from time to time. We've been talking about it a little bit, Nicole and me. I have to say that I've been in this business for so many years, and I've been touched by many books, as I am a reader, as you all are. And still, I still am completely taken by what you can do with your books, how you can reach out to these people. What you've read now. These people in the street, they've been transformed by your book, by your books, by what you write. It's fascinating what a writer can do, what literature can do. It makes my life so much richer. Not only reading, but also being able to somehow, from time to time, assist and try to reach out with these magic words of the writers I love. It's magic, and I've heard you talking about literature and what we all talk about. Of course, that we are reading less, that our children are more spending time with the devices, playing, and don't have time for reading. And it's I know we all repeat this discussion, but it's interesting to hear how you feel about it. You have two boys, not very. They are 10 and 13, so they are in the age when they, of course, discover all the possibilities to how to play and I guess watch TV as well and so on. How do you feel about what's going on now with reading and writing and first of all, how we can make literature cool again?
Well, I think one of the crises have to do. Well, there are two. There are many, but there are two that I think a lot about. One is the fact that we are losing our capacity for deep reading, and deep reading is the kind of reading that we do when we read novels or poetry. So the kind of reading that we do a lot of now, and we're doing very well, is kind of speed reading. So when we're reading online. All of these studies show how we're reading like in an F pattern. So we read a long line and then we skim down the page, and we read a shorter line and then we skim down further. So we're really like cherry picking for information, and our brains, the speed of our processing for those bits of information is getting faster, but we're losing those things that happen when we have the capacity for slow reading. And one of those things is the act of empathy. And empathy really, truly is the thing I feel that literature does most profoundly, because it is the only place that I can think of in which we have the opportunity to actually be inside another person's consciousness and life. It's not the same as watching a film. As moved as we are by the characters in a film or on TV, we are still passively watching them. We are not inhabiting them in so deep and existential a way as we do in literature. And we're losing that empathetic ability. We're losing our ability to make complex, remote connections, allusions between the subtle way in which in novels meaning is constructed in a very subterranean way that our minds are just losing the ability to do. I think, so I worry a lot about that. That, I think, can always come back. The brain is plastic, and we are as quickly as we lose it, I do think that we can gain it back. The question is whether people, young people, or we will feel the lack of it badly enough. And there too, I feel hopeful, because I think, I already see amongst young people a frustration with the ways in which technology has really impoverished their lives. It's made our lives incredibly convenient, but I don't know when convenience became our number one value. It wasn't always.
It's interesting to say.
Yeah, but it's really impoverished us, and it's made us kind of, the slaves to, but large corporate technology that we are basically making money for, and we're losing our time and our silence and our ability to connect with each other. So the question is, at what point will we become so impatient and frustrated with that we actually break the habit and do something about it? And when we do something about it, I think the largest, most impressive, most meaningful act of resistance is to read a book. Because to read a book is to decide to be alone with yourself and another mind that decided to be alone for a long time thinking about something. That other mind who wrote that novel didn't need a whole team, a corporate team, to green light their project. They didn't need a lot of money. They didn't need anything. They just needed to be alone and to think for a really long time about something that mattered to them. And the reader does the same. And that is a kind of act of resistance, it seems to me. And the gift that it gives back is incalculable. So the question is will young people, or will we, because we're also guilty of this, we're all reading less and less, will we notice that and have the wherewithal and the strength to actually do something about it?
Wonderful to hear that you are optimistic. I do too. It's my job, maybe, but otherwise I won't be able to do what I do. But I'm very happy that you are optimistic about it, and we can feel it. I think today. I mean, all this longing for and trying to use mindfulness. It comes from this need of longing for silence and for having some time for our own thoughts. This is wonderful to hear, and I also love the idea that you have of writing, because you mentioned when you read that to write is it's a pleasure, and it's something really difficult, but still giving you lots of pleasure.
But that was definitely something that I had to learn and take again for myself, and I think it's interesting, but that happened, I think probably about 7 or 8 years ago. It became a project for me to find again real pleasure in writing. I found it in a kind of sideways way. I started about 9 years ago now, to dance, and a very certain specific kind of dance.
Okay.
Actually there's a section about it in the book in which the character is talking about being in Israel, and there's really, I think, the best living choreographer working today is an Israeli called Ohad Naharin. He's the choreographer at Bat Sheva, and he developed a dance language, a dance research laboratory, in a sense, he developed it about 25 years ago. And he developed it in order to, he was a dancer himself, and he was injured, and he was trying to find new ways of moving, and in order to do that, he had to connect pleasure to effort. And in some way, this whole language of Gaga, which is about exploring your body, how you move, and it became, mind you, not just for his dancers, it became for people. So now there are classes really all over the world. I was just in Berlin, and there were like 3 places teaching classes there, I'm sure, and you can find here. Because a lot of the dancers, former dancers of Bat Sheva, then move different places, and they start to teach Gaga classes. And anybody can do it, you don't have to be a dancer. But it's built on many, many, many ideas, but at the core of it is this idea of the connection between pleasure and effort. And to me, practicing that and going out of my head, where I was spending so much time, and into my body, which is an equally emotional place, and not really, we can't really put a division between those things, right, mind and body anymore, was really significant in a way to return to this idea of a way of working and writing that really depended on pleasure.
So you could apply it on when you were writing by thinking about the feeling when you dance?
I think like all things, when you bring them into your life so strongly, they start to change how you process things. Like your whole neural processing begins to change. So, I mean, for example, it's like the problem of depression. Depression, when people are depressed, they ruminate, and so they're following the same thought pathways over and over until a deep groove, and it's very hard to get out of that. But also, on the other hand, to return to this idea of plasticity of the brain, there is also the other hand that when you start to have positive or affirmative experiences, like this is why people talk so much about gratitude and the need to be. But when you start to have these other experiences, they too become habitual in the brain. So I think that the more that I did it, and the more that I just surrounded myself with people who were thinking about making art in that way, and I know Ohad very well, so I actually have watched him make many of his pieces in the last 10 years, and so watching how he makes art and that process, and again, how much joy and pleasure and experimentation and play is involved in that, I think I just learned a lot, and something kind of permanently changed in my own thinking and my own process.
So it's possible to break our patterns?
I certainly think so. I mean, I think this is what is one of the definitions of our humanity, in that we are self-aware enough to know that we have the capacity for change. And as much as we want the comfort of the sameness and stability, we also know we can take that leap, and we do. I see people do it over and over and over again, and I think it's a very moving thing when it happens to us.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
This, I think we are rounding up here, and I just say reading Nicole is just an investment in getting a better life. Very easy. It's about love, and it's about relationships. It's about how we understand ourselves better. It's a great pleasure to have you here. We are a little bit late, but I promised organizers that if there are any questions, you are welcome to ask them. It's also a pleasure that we have a bookseller with us. This book, we haven't talked that much about it, but it's called Dunkelskog in Swedish. But it's a book about life, and it's a very, very good one. So that's all I have to say about it. If you haven't read A History of Love and you want to know what my flight was about 20 years ago, maybe it wasn't 20 years ago, it was 15 years ago, then the book is there as well, always. It has been in print constantly. And I can add that you were here before in Sweden, in Stockholm before, and I will never forget when you were in the Culture House in Stockholm, and it was maybe for a later book by you called Great House, but in the audience we were completely taken by the fact that not only the audience was huge, it was like 450 people, all they could take, but in the audience were all these teenage girls who were coming to you to get the signed copies of The History of Love. They were crying. They said, "Oh, I know this book. It's falling apart." But I put notes in every one of them, and my mother has bought 3 more, and I love this book. It changed my. I know. I think in the audience of 450 people who read you, there were maybe 200 girls who were completely taken by it. It's powerful because then you were talking about another book, but they were all coming with the pocket books. Yes, what did you say?
I said, where were all the boys? I didn't realize it was only for girls.
I don't remember the boys. Probably they were there too, but the girls were very outspoken, and they were really crying, a number of them. So this book, it was published many years ago, but still it's still in print, and not only girls, but young people are deeply touched by it still.
Thank you.
So anyway, here we stop. Thank you, and a little applause to Nicole.
I think.
Yes.
I think there's a microphone
Har vi
there.
någon publikfråga? Så...
Is there a question? So let us know.
I've been told that Swedish audiences are very shy, and I'm hoping that's not going to be true. Anyone have a question?
But if you are too shy, you can ask when Nicole is signing. There was
Du ska få
a
mikrofonen.
brave one. Okay.
To Tel Aviv. So which book were you talking about?
We were talking about
Oh, you were
this.
talking about that.
We were talking about it, but we could have talked much more about it. It's telling the story, how the story is told, and there are so many themes in this book. But the idea was to talk a little bit about writing and a little bit about publishing too.
It sounds absolutely wonderful, and I hope they've got lots of copies in English and Swedish
I think they
here in the library.
I'm afraid we don't have copies in English.
I think they do. They do.
There are a few, yeah.
No, but
okay.
in the library.
Oh, in the library.
Wonderful. Yeah, the library have them all, I'm sure. Yeah. Okay, anybody else? Here we are. Now, so we wait for the microphone. No, it doesn't work. I can repeat your question. Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah.
I think that's...
You repeat the question?
Yeah, no, I can. The very careful reader is asking about a thread in the book that gets repeated and doesn't get entirely tied up. I think it'd be better for me not to say too much about that because I have people who haven't read it yet. But suffice, I will say this, which is that there's nothing. You said, did I forget? Rest assured, there's nothing that I forgot. I'm very. No, yeah, I think and I also will say that I as a reader am often frustrated when I read a book in which I feel that the author doesn't trust me. Which is not to say that he doesn't trust me to know everything or figure out everything, but doesn't trust me to make what I will with what I'm given. And I try to leave a lot of space for my readers because I trust them in that way. So if we want to talk after, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else before we stop for signing and talking more privately? Why signing?
I would like to know how your work process looks like. How do you do your work when you write?
Like a kind of like daily habits or something like that. I used to before I had children. I used to wake up really early because when you write right when you've woken up. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but just generally our critical faculties wake up a little bit after the rest of us. So there's this golden moment period in which you write without self-criticism. Then the critic wakes up like soon afterwards. But it's really a wonderful, magical time. So I used to get my best writing done there, and then I had kids, and that time was gone. As I get older, I tend to be less rigorous and less of a rule maker about how I work. Maybe this is connected to pleasure, the feeling of wanting it to be pleasure. And by the same token, I have to get my work done, and so it is a daily, more or less daily habit. I don't know where I'm going ever when I write a book, ever. I have one notebook for all 4 books that my father once gave me, in which I've taken the only notes I've ever taken for any books, and it's still like room. It's not, like not even halfway done. So I don't plan things or plot them in advance. I'm really writing as an act of improvisation, as an act of discovery. And my work I think, is really about finding the questions that I'm going to ask. And once I find those questions, it's about sustaining those questions throughout the book. It's not about finding the answers or giving the answers. So in that way, it can be a really uncomfortable process. And I used to cry my way through the early books, and then I kind of gained some trust that it works out. Because at the end, it's about finding, a design, and all those thoughts are coming from the same mind, and there is some design and will there, but it takes obviously just patience, and better understanding of which are the right accidents to follow, the ones that lead you to gold. Yeah.
We were talking before today that you have to be brave to write.
You have to be brave to publish.
Brave to publish.
Different. Yeah.
So, meaning that you have to pick things from yourself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I guess there's 2 different things. Maybe the conversation we were having is about the different places one can write from. And I think there are those writers who write from a place that is more distant from themselves. And I think this allows them to be able to write more often, more quickly. I think the place that I write from, and a lot of writers that I know write from, is a very, very personal place. And it's raw, and it can be exhausting, because even when the characters don't have your name, it's just as personal and just as exposing in some way. Usually it's coming from many things in your own life that have affected you. And then when it's over, you need to rest. So it takes time before the new urgency
feel
arrives.
Completely empty when you are ready?
I just feel exhausted in a way afterwards. But I don't know if that. So that when I say about bravery, I mean, I don't know, because in a sense we can write anything so long as we're alone. But then once it goes out into the world, it's a whole other can of worms, as they say.
Okay. Okay, shall we stop here? No, there is a last question here.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if you still write poetry, and if we might get to read some of it at some point.
The answer to that used to be, when I'm old and wise, that I would go back to writing poetry. I just don't know, and I think I'm open to anything. I think so many surprising things have happened to me in my life at this point that I just don't really know. But I still read poetry. I really, and I think it's still in some way. There's an understructure of it in my work. I don't think my work would be the same if I'd come to novels from a different route. But for the time being, I'm still relatively addicted to the novel. Although I just finished. I know you don't have a tradition in Europe in the same way that we do in America, but we have a tradition of short story writing. So I just finished a collection of short stories, and that was the first kind of experimentation with a smaller form. So maybe I am getting closer again. I don't know. But I really love writing novels, so I'll probably go back there next. Yeah.
Good news that we have a volume of short stories to read. I think this is worth a very big applause.
Okay.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.